Focus over the next several recordings will be on the texts of the poetry in the fascicule. And the idea here is, rather than having discussions in a classroom setting where people are able to come with the different ideas that you might have had reading the poem, I will try to read the poems along with you and to cover the different ideas that are typically associated with these poems, right? That we typically see in interpretations of these poems, so that you can use this range of other people's reading as a way of uh, confirming your own reading, as things that might resist your own reading, as ways of deepening your personal understanding of the works in the fascicule. So the idea is really not that I read through the fascicule for you, that would be counterproductive, but that you read each work in the fascicule before you listen to the recordings, and then that you come to the recordings with your ideas about the poems in mind, ready to challenge those ideas, to reinforce those ideas, as the case may be, based on what I say in these recordings. Okay? So read first, reread first, think about each of the texts in the fascicule first, and then once that work has been done independently, you can come to the recordings and use the recordings as a way of putting that independent work into perspective. Okay. I think that's the best that we can do in the current circumstances. So we look at the three sonnets by William Shakespeare in the recording today: Sonnet 12, Sonnet 18, Sonnet 147. Just to give a little bit of general perspective before I read these works and we think about them together, not much is known about Shakespeare's biography. Right? You have his dates on the screen in front of you, 1564 to 1616. So the major figure of the English Renaissance. Shakespeare is writing during the latter part of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and then the reign of James I. So he is the key figure of the English literary Renaissance. And much of what Shakespeare has done in literature obviously serves as a kind of foundation for later literature in the UK and indeed in the English language. Shakespeare was, as you know, primarily a writer for the theater, right? He was primarily a dramatist. And he was a businessman, right? He managed his troupe of actors. He was the writer for this troupe of actors. He acted in the plays that he himself composed. One of the games of literary scholars is to imagine which parts Shakespeare might have played in the different theater plays that he wrote. And we have records of how Shakespeare's theater company grew in London during the years where he was active, of his relations with people in power in the London political and cultural circles in these years. Records that are complete enough that, as you probably know, the Globe Theatre, Shakespeare's theatre, has been reconstructed in contemporary London as, kind of a tourist attraction slash cultural landmark on the south bank of the Thames. That being said, with all of these records that we have, and despite Shakespeare's importance, there are a number of uncertainties. People still fight over the way in which the plays were composed, even to the point of people questioning whether William Shakespeare was actually the main author of these plays. Without going as far as that, these conspiracy theories about who really wrote Shakespeare's plays, people question how much of a role other actors in the troupe had in assembling the texts. Shakespeare's plays were not published until after his death, right? So there's a publishing process following Shakespeare's death that brings these plays to us. So, in what form do they come to us? There are multiple texts, different texts for many of Shakespeare's plays, and so on and so on and so on. So, a lot of Shakespeare is shrouded in mystery, and the sonnets are something that's rather unique in Shakespeare's canon, in Shakespeare's written work. For the most part, he wrote these plays that were to be performed in front of a public that was paying to see them, right? It was a business venture. The sonnets, a different form, right? Not dramatic literature, but lyric poetry, and something of an exception in Shakespeare's canon. So, scholars have questioned why Shakespeare wrote these sonnets, when he wrote the sonnets. Just to finish up with this little biographical background, one of the theories that people like to have fun with, and that might be an acceptable one, is that Shakespeare wrote these sonnets during a period when the theaters were closed, right? So he was always writing. He wrote constantly. The theaters were closed, so he couldn't write for the stage anymore. And so he wrote lyric verse. So one of the suggestions is that the sonnets were written when the theaters were closed in London. Shakespeare had to return home to Stratford upon Avon while the theaters were closed because of the plague. Fits well with the current context, doesn't it, guys? And while he was home because the theaters were closed for sanitary reasons, he wrote these sonnets. And some scholars have gone so far as to dare, putting an exact date on this and say, okay, it must have happened during a plague period just prior to when Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet. Because if you read the play of Romeo and Juliet, you have a number of the exchanges between the two lovers that are written in a kind of a sonnet form, right? So the idea is Shakespeare has to return home. He has no choice but to write lyric poetry, right? Since the theaters are closed to him. And he comes back to London with bits of this lyric poetry still in his pockets, so to speak. And these scraps of work that are left over from the sonnet period go into Romeo and Juliet. All right. Just a little bit of background for those who like to have fun with such things. Always interesting to see the type of genesis that literary works might have within a specific context, cultural context, and the context of the author's life. In terms of the way in which the sonnets themselves, if we just focus on the text and not the biography and the context, the way in which the sonnets themselves were written, Shakespeare's sonnets are divided into two basic groups. Right? You have a speaker who addresses a subject, an addressee. You have the speaker and the addressee. So the I of the poem is speaking to a you in the poem. And most of Shakespeare's sonnets are addressed to a, quote, young man, an idealization of youth and beauty. The I is the aging poet, the you is the young man. So these are called the young man sonnets. The second group of sonnets, a middle-aged speaker is speaking to a middle-aged woman. So these are the dark lady sonnets. Okay, so on the one hand you have a gap in generation, and you have this speaker addressing an idealization of youth and beauty, an idealized love, if you like. And in the second group of sonnets, you have two people who are different sexes, same age. You have a much more direct physical expression of love in those sonnets. So the subject of all of these sonnets is love, beauty, the endurance of beauty, the endurance of emotion over time, and so on. But there's a difference in tone and there's a difference in addressee between the young man sonnets and the dark lady sonnets. Sonnets 12 and 18 are young man sonnets, right? The speaker is addressing the young man of the sonnets. Sonnet 147 is a dark lady sonnet. The speaker is addressing the dark lady of the sonnets. And when I say middle age, I should be careful because middle age at this time is 40. So we have to be careful about relatively how we see the speaker and the addressee in these poems. All right, so let's just one last little bit of context before we start reading the three texts. Both Sonnet 12 and Sonnet 18 are addressed to the young man. In each of these cases, the problem is the same. The speaker identifies the youth and beauty of the young man and realizes that youth and beauty, which seem ideal, which seem permanent now in the moment, will eventually fade into old age, right? Will be swept away by time. So Sonnet 12, we start with the clock that tells the time, right? The clock that tells the time, which causes the speaker to question the beauty of the young man. Sonnet 18, the idealized summer day, right? This beautiful summer day that seems to last forever. And the problem of nature's changing course, okay? The summer day might seem to last forever, but it is passing like everything else. So the seeming permanence of beauty when beheld in the moment compared to the knowledge that all things must pass. That's the basic problem of Sonnet 12 and of Sonnet 18. Each of these sonnets tries to propose a solution to that problem. In Sonnet 12, the solution that is proposed is natural, right? Rebirth with each new generation, right? Breed, the birth of new children who will renew this cycle of youth, who will incarnate beauty for another generation. So the solution that's proposed in Sonnet 12 is the cycle of the generations. Your beauty might fade, but you will have children, and they will have children, and they will have children. And so beauty within nature endures. So a natural solution that is proposed in Sonnet 12. In Sonnet 18, the solution that is proposed is that of art, okay? So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. This being the poem, okay? The speaker who manages to capture the beauty and the youth of the young man in these eternal lines of the poem, and therefore within art preserves the beauty of the young man for future generations. Okay, so that's the basic structure of Shakespeare's sonnets, right? We had fun at first talking about where this might fit in Shakespeare's biography in the midst of all of these magnificent plays. That's a matter of speculation for biographers and literary historians. We then talked about the overall structure of the sonnets, right? We have the young man sonnets and we have the dark lady sonnets. And then within the young man sonnets, where the subject is the idealized beauty of this young man that the poet addresses, we have different types of approaches to the young man's beauty. Sonnet 12, the idea of preserving that beauty through the cycles of nature. Sonnet 18, the relation between nature and art. There you have the major themes. Okay, so let's take these one by one now, and I'll give you a few paths into the poems that you can then build upon with your personal reading, and obviously with dictionary work, right? Especially for these older poems, the work of looking up words in dictionaries is going to be important to the way in which you interpret the texts. Okay, Sonnet 12. When I do count the clock that tells the time, and see the brave day sunk in hideous night, when I behold the violet past prime, and sable curls all silvered o'er with white, when lofty trees I see, barren of leaves, which erst from heat did canopy the herd, and summer's green all girded up in sheaves, borne on the bier with white and bristly beard. Then of thy beauty do I question make, that thou amongst the wastes of time must go, since sweets and beauties do themselves forsake and die as fast as they see others grow. And nothing gainst time's scythe can make defence, save breed to brave him when he takes thee hence. All right, so let's start by going back to the revision sheets on poetic form that we looked at in the previous recording. We have a sonnet form here, the typical Shakespearean sonnet. We have the rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Almost all perfect rhymes with one or two minor exceptions. Right? For example, beard and herd, that's a half rhyme. But for the most part, a very typical sonnet rhyme scheme. We have the turn, as we would expect. 8 lines where we address the subject in one way, 6 lines where we address the subject in another way. We even have an internal rhyme that draws out this division between the two parts. When, then, right? The first 8 lines begin with when, the last 6 lines begin with then. So this rhyme is there to insist upon the point where we shift from one perspective to the other. I won't dwell upon this point, but you can go a long way in analyzing this poem by looking at the way in which Shakespeare uses alliteration. Okay, this poem makes heavy use of alliteration, even to the point of almost dividing lines, right, in certain cases, based on alliteration. Count, clock, right, line 1, count, clock, tell, time, okay? The two main stresses in the first part of the line are built around the C alliteration. The two main stresses in the second part of the line are built around the T alliteration, okay? And you have other examples of that. For example, born, beer, bristly, beard, right? Use of alliteration to emphasize key images and to make certain parts of the line stand out from one another. Bits of this poem, it's almost as though Shakespeare is hearkening back to an older way of writing verse based on strong alliteration in either side of the verse line. I won't go into the history of that, but there's kind of a history in English poetry that is a history of building lines around stresses accompanied by alliteration. And we see examples of that in this poem. Other examples of alliteration: green, girded, okay, since, sweets, okay, and so on. So, without dwelling on that, if you look at where the strongest alliteration is in this poem, you find many of the strongest images. All right. In terms of the meter, as I said in my commentary on the revision sheet, we have here a poem which is written in a fairly strict iambic pentameter with a few variants. Okay, so for example, alliteration and a spondee, past prime. Okay, we leave out an unstressed syllable here. I behold the violet past prime. Okay, so we emphasize that idea of being past your prime, as is the speaker, contrary to the young man, with the alliteration, and the alliteration reinforced by a spondee, two stressed syllables together. So for the most part, iambic pentameter. Few variants on iambic pentameter, like that spondee at the end of line 3. Okay. In terms of the content of the poem and the basic imagery, the first 8 lines of this sonnet beautifully hold in suspension 2 images at the same time. We have 2 extended metaphors that are working together within these 8 lines. We have the metaphor of the land moving through, right, the agriculture, the rural landscape, moving through the cycles of the seasons. Okay, so the fields which bloom, which turn golden in summer, which are harvested, and then which are covered in frost in the winter. That's one image over the first 8 lines. The changing landscape in the rural setting in relation to agriculture. The second image, which is there alongside that first one, is the image of the individual who moves from youth to middle age to old age to death. Okay? So we have these images of flowering, the violet. We have the image of midday, the brave day, okay, which give way to night. The blooming of the flower, which fades. Sable curls, sable is black, right? So the black curls on the head of the young man, which become gray and then become white as he ages. Lofty trees that canopied the herd, the trees that have their leaves that are then barren of leaves. Okay, so the cycle of the seasons and the cycle of life. And very concisely, we see these 2 things together. Think of how few syllables Shakespeare is working with here. And we see these 4 states at the same time in these first 8 lines. The fields in summer, the fields in winter. The man in his youth, the man as he ages and dies. Okay? And then this comes to a head in line 7. Summer is green, all girded up in sheaves. Okay, so the green of the fields in early summer, which then become golden as the summer goes on. The sheaves, right, les meules de foin, right, on rassemble le foin at the end of the harvest, right? So the wheat sheaves, right? So the summer fields have been cut. The sheaves, right? The grain has been gathered together into bunches, and then they're carried in from the fields for the winter. Borne on the bier, right? The bier is a platform, right? Before we had mechanical tractors, the village would go out into the fields. They would gather up these sheaves, these wheat sheaves that have been gathered. They would put them on the platform, the bier, and they would carry them in for storage for the winter. The bier is also the platform on which the dead body is carried to the grave. Okay? So, this image of the young man getting older, the fields moving from the spring flowers to the fall harvest, come to a head in this image of the summer's green now cut, girded in sheaves, put on the platform, and carried in with white and bristly beard. That line there, born on the bier with white and bristly beard. Look at the alliteration and look at the way that the two images come together in that magnificent line 8. Born on the bier with white and bristly beard. It is two things at once. It is these wheat sheaves that are gathered up and put on the platform and carried into the barn for the winter with the frost on them, the white and bristly beard. It's the frost that is gathered on the wheat sheaves before they are carried into the barn for the winter. It is also the dead body of the man who's being carried to the grave, right? The dead man being carried on the bier with his white and bristly beard, the unkempt old man, the beauty that had once been the sable curls, the black curls on the young man's head. Now he is an old corpse with a white and bristly beard being carried off for burial. I can't think of a more concise and powerful way of tying those two images together in one line. Transition, then. When, then. Okay? So once the poet has presented these two images of the aging land and the aging person, then he asks himself the question of what can be done to combat the passage of time, right? Because the passage of time is going to carry you away, thy beauty, right? The beauty of the young man, just like it carries everything else away. Then of thy beauty do I question make, that thou amongst the wastes of time must go, and so on and so on. And the answer that he gives is an answer that is found in the very cycle of the nature that he has described in the first 8 lines. Okay? Nothing against time's scythe can make defense. What is the scythe? The scythe, right? Same word in French, basically. The seau, right? It's the tool that is used to cut the hay in the fields. It's the harvesting tool, cutting down the hay that is going to be girded up in sheaves. So time is the thing that cuts down these plants, that cuts down the hay in the field. And against that, what is the defense? It is rebirth in the spring. So each individual must grow old and die and be cut down by time. But the cycle of the generations allows us to brave time, to accept the cycle of life, because we find youth and beauty again in our children and grandchildren and each passing generation. Okay? So that's the basic structure of Sonnet 12. I should probably just leave it there rather than try to reconstruct, but I think you see the 8 and 6, the two different perspectives, the first 8 lines, the second 6 lines, the way in which the young man is addressed, these two images that develop in parallel over the first 8 lines, the image of the young man as he ages, the image of the fields as they move from spring through to winter. All of that brought together with that 8th line, born on the bier with white and bristly beard. And then the solution, in quotes, the solution that is proposed is the solution of the cycle of generations. Okay, I'm going to do the next 2 sonnets in a second part to make sure that I don't create a file that's too big.